Random thoughts. In this video, I'm going to talk about the Ajuran Sultanate. This is a sultanate that we can say became the East Africa superpower. And this is a sultanate that is often described as Africa's only hydraulic civilization or empire, which it means that it's the empire in Africa, or the only empire known in Africa, or the only civilization known in Africa that built very extensive irrigation systems and water management systems. It is also known to be the African, we can say, Commonwealth, the first African Commonwealth to have an embassy in China. Of course, there is a likelihood that there were others that had contacts with China, but there is no record of that. So the first recorded incident of an African Commonwealth having a diplomatic relationship with China was with the Ajuran Sultanate. Now, the Ajuran Sultanate emerged in the 13th century, and it is said that it was the expansion of a kingdom in what we know today as Ethiopia, the eastern side of Ethiopia, a kingdom that used to be known as the Garen Kingdom. It is that kingdom that expanded, and then it became the Ajuran Sultanate. And of course, it was ruled by dynasties, and the dynasty that ruled the Ajuran Kingdom or the Ajuran Sultanate came from that part of Ethiopia, the eastern side. Of course, that time that part was not part of Ethiopia. Of course, Ethiopia has expanded in the very recent years to include that part that we know today as eastern side of Ethiopia. Now, during its height, it covered a significant area, actually. It covered, we can say, close to 2/3 of what we know today as Somalia. It also covered a significant part of what we know today as Ethiopia. And what we know today in Kenya is the northeastern part of Kenya. All that region was part of the Ajuran Sultanate. And of course, it became a major center of commerce in the East African coast, and ships used to come from all over the world, from China, from the Arabian Peninsula, from Europe, Portugal in particular, from all over the place. They used to come to the Ajuran Empire. And of course, the Ajuran Empire or the Ajuran Sultanate had several ports, including Mogadishu. And the ships used to come bringing in different kinds of goods and then picking different kinds of goods and taking them to the rest of the world. And of course, as I've mentioned, the Ajuran Sultanate is known as Africa's only hydraulic civilization. And the Sultanate built very complex irrigation systems, dikes, and all that. And then that water was managed, especially along River Shebele and River Juba. And the water was used to do irrigation, of course, and to do a lot of farming. And some of the crops that were grown include sorghum, maize, beans, cotton, bananas. They also grew barley and wheat and such kinds of crops. So there was a lot of farming that went on in that sultanate. And they also, of course, kept animals. And there used to be even exportation of horses, actually, from the Ajuran Sultanate. And they also used to export gold, wax, ivory, and such kinds of things from that sultanate. And it is mentioned that, especially there are notes that were left by Vasco da Gama, and also somebody went by the name Duarte Barbosa. These were Portuguese generals, technically. And they used to come to that part of the world. Of course, they were trying to conquer that kingdom. Of course, the Portuguese managed to conquer Mombasa, Kilwa, and Zanzibar. And they were so keen on taking over the Ajuran Sultanate, and they used to attack the empire so often. But they also left notes saying that these were very well established. This was a very well established commonwealth, and they say the cities were very well built. Mogadishu and Merka had these story buildings and mosques and very elaborate systems, so they were well-kept cities. And of course, the issue of the Ajuran Sultanate having an embassy in China is a fact that is documented by one Bin Battuta, who talks in particular about some guy who went by the name Said of Mogadishu. And this was somebody who was sent to China to represent the interest of the Ajuran Sultanate. And he did meet this guy and has mentions him a little bit in his texts. Now, something else important that has to be said about the Ajuran Sultanate is that the Ajuran Sultanate contributed significantly to the chasing away of the Portuguese from the East African coast. the Portuguese had managed to settle in East African coast, Mombasa, Malindi, and Kilwa, and Zanzibar. They had taken over those regions, and they did control the trade along the East African coast and the Red Sea, all the way to India, of course. But the Ajuran did become a huge resistance to that control of the Portuguese, and the Portuguese knew that the Ajuran Sultanate was a major stumbling block in the region, and they tried so many times to attack and try to take control of the Ajuran Sultanate. There were times when the Ajuran Sultanate and the Portuguese did sign some treaties, but the Portuguese never managed to take over the Sultanate. They did attack and sometimes destroy the city, especially Mogadishu, America, and such cities, but they never managed to take control of the Sultanate or any part of the Sultanate. Now, over time, the Sultanate, of course, had other allies, or it had its own allies, in particular the Ottoman Empire. And with the help of the Ottoman Empire, and in fact, it is said that it's the Ajuran Sultanate that called for help from the Ottoman Empire to help them chase out the Portuguese from East Africa. And the Ottoman Empire came in and it helped the Ajuran Sultanate, along other allies, of course, to push out the Portuguese. Initially, they were not very successful, and we can't say that they did actually in one act did push out the Portuguese. They used to, of course, sometimes chase them out of Mombasa and the other city-states along the coast, but the Portuguese will come back. But that, of course, in the long term, made it very difficult for the Portuguese to continue being in East Africa, and at some point they just had to leave. Now, as I've mentioned, the Ajuran Sultanate is thought to have started or to have really expanded in the 13th century from Ethiopia, and then it expanded to the regions I've described, almost a huge chunk of what we know today as Somalia. We could say 2/3 of that land, and also a significant part of what we know today as Kenya, and also, of course, Ethiopia, as I've mentioned. So that was around 13th century when it started expanding, and during its height, it covered that land, and then it went on for close to 3 centuries. The decline started, we can say, around 16th, 17th century. That's when the decline of the Sultanate started happening. And we can, I think, and this is a speculation, it's most likely that the Ajuran Sultanate had a huge impact on the other Commonwealth that were hinterland, especially in what we know today as Kenya, Ethiopia. I think the Ajuran Sultanate did have a huge impact on those Commonwealth, especially maybe through trade and other influences. The Sultanate must have had a huge influence on those other Commonwealths, mostly republics, of course. We never know the extent of that, but we can assume that the Ajuran Sultanate did influence the Eastern African, the Commonwealth that emerged in East Africa, or the Commonwealth that existed in East Africa, especially from beginning 13th century to 17th century. Now, what led to the decline of the Ajuran Sultanate is a multiple of things that led to the decline of the Ajuran Sultanate. We can definitely say that the fight with the Portuguese most likely contributed to the collapse, but not to a large extent. What really collapsed the Ajuran Sultanate is internal wrangling. And at some point, the leadership made decisions that kind of like made running the Sultanate as a single unit very difficult, and that came in the form of taxes. At some point, the rulers of the Sultanate started charging very high taxes on the population, and people started feeling that they were not being treated fairly, and there were rebellions, and some people or some parts of the Sultanates broke away and formed their own commonwealths, and that actually put a lot of pressure and disintegrated the Sultanate in the end. So in the end, mostly it's pointed out that what really collapsed the Sultanate was high taxations on the population, which of course led to rebellion from different sides of the Sultanate, and then the collapse of the Sultanate. So that is a commonwealth that became or was a superpower in East Africa for close to 300 years actually. And it is unfortunate that the Ajuran Sultanate is not talked about enough in history actually. And But when you try to study it, you realize that this is a very important civilization that emerged in East Africa or in the coast of East Africa. And this civilization did shape not only what we Somalia became or what we know today as Ethiopia became, Kenya, most likely even beyond that. Those are my random thoughts.